Hello, I'm John Clark from Western Michigan University. I'm the president of the Michigan Political Science Association, and I'm excited to welcome you to our panel on the 2020 election. If we were meeting in person, our election roundtable is typically one of our best attended conference events. The fact that we're going virtual this year is in some ways a disadvantage, perhaps, but it's great that we still have the opportunity to bring together some election experts to talk about the 2020 election, what we should be looking for, both nationally and especially here in Michigan. I'm joined today by two election experts that you'll be hearing from shortly. Claire Gothrow is a research associate at the Center for American Women in Politics at Rutgers University. She's coming to us today from Pennsylvania, where apparently it's warm. And when we get to see Claire, you'll see that she is sitting outside. And we're also joined by David Dulio from Oakland University here in Michigan, who, because it's Michigan, is inside today. We're going to spend some time talking about the things that each of us are paying attention to in this election cycle, and then we'll have the opportunity to sort of switch from that national level back over to the Michigan level. So, Claire, what's one of the things that you're paying attention to in this election cycle?
First, I just want to say thank you so much for having me on the panel. And it's hard to pick one thing to pick in this election that I'm paying attention to, because although it's been in some ways a remarkably steady race, there are just still so many interesting dynamics. But one thing that I'm really looking for or paying attention to is the gender gap in the presidential election and even in down ballot races as well. So the gender gap refers to the difference in the percentage of women and the percentage of men voting for any given candidate. So I guess to frame why this is sort of what I'm paying attention to, I'll say a little bit about sort of the gender gap in American politics generally and how it might impact the outcome of the 2020 election. So the gender gap emerged really in the 1980s, as I'm sure you both know, with women more likely than men to back Democratic candidates. And it's interesting because when women first won the right to vote, a lot of people thought that this women's vote would emerge and the political landscape would change because of the way newly enfranchised women would vote. But that didn't really happen. Women basically voted the same way as men did until the 80s. But one of the reasons I'm really paying attention to this gap in 2020 is because, as we remember, in 2016, a lot of people expected that there would be this historic gender gap and it would be through the roof because of the historic nature of Hillary Clinton's candidacy. And there was a sizable gender gap of 11 points, but it wasn't historic. It only matched the gap in 1996. So at the Center for American Women in Politics, we've really been tracking the gender gap in both the national and the battleground state polls. And we all know these polls have their limitations, but we're seeing that it's possible that there could be a historic gap in the 2020 election. The average gender gap in the polls has been around 17 or 18 points, which I don't think is actually what we're going to see. The modal gap in sort of the highest quality polls has been more around 10 to 13 points, which I think is more realistic. But yeah, this is what I'm really paying attention to in this election, is what the gender gap's going to look like, and also what that gap looks like broken down by racial and ethnic groups as well.
So one of the things that interested me in 2016 was the fact that there were an awful lot of women who regularly support Republican candidates who at the end of the day behaved like Republican women behave. Are you expecting that to happen again this time around, or do you think it's going to be a little different? From what you've been looking at, what's your take on that so far?
Yeah, I think your question really highlights why, sort of under the umbrella of the gender gap, it's really important to disaggregate things by race. Um, because when we really take a look at the gender gap, we see that a lot of that gap is driven by women of color. And that's highlighted by the fact that a majority of white women have voted Republican in every presidential election in the modern era, except for two, which I think was 1964 and 1996. I think the dynamic might shift a little bit in 2020. We've seen, for example, college educated white women really move towards Joe Biden in the polls. And also in 2018, I mean, college educated white women turned out in droves to vote for Democratic candidates in that midterm election. So I think that indicates that a lot of these white women who might otherwise, um, vote Republican are swinging more towards the Democrats. Um, so I think that's going to be important as well.
You coming to me, John?
Sure. What have you been paying attention to?
Sure. Let me react a little bit to what Claire said. I think that that's really interesting. The gender gap, as she noted, right, is a longstanding factor in American politics. We see it at the presidential level. We see it at other levels. And I think that if anything, the surprise, as she noted, right, was the small nature of it in 2016 with more college-educated white women voting for Trump than we thought would happen. And I don't think there's any question that we've seen that support erode, including in 2018, when the Democrats had successes across the country. Maybe we can talk a bit about whether or not there was a blue wave in 2018 a little later, but I think that there's no doubt that especially in suburban areas, we saw the sort of the suburban educated female voter go heavily for Democrats in 2018. The question is whether or not Trump can get any of them back in 2016. It doesn't seem like that's the case, but that leads into my next point, and it's not really a dynamic that's happening right now. I think that we are, as Claire mentioned, this is a pretty stable race at the moment, and I think it's going to take something really drastic to shake it up at this point. And that's not saying that can't happen, because we've seen some pretty unique elements or events in the 2020 campaign. But I think it's really interesting for us as political scientists, as political junkies, as analysts to think about the nature of polling and to watch and see. And we won't know this until after, right? But I'm really curious to see if pollsters have cracked the code on how to sample in some key states, right? And we could talk about Michigan, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Ohio, Florida, right, where there were some states last time around where the polls, as you both know, were off by significant margins, right? In Wisconsin, the last Real Clear Politics average underestimated Trump support by over 7 points. They missed Trump support by 5.5 in Ohio, and of course here in Michigan by over 3 points, right? And I think that was due to a lack of understanding who was going to turn out in 2016. I think here in Michigan, it's pretty clear that places like Wayne County were oversampled or overweighted, and places like up north in rural counties were undersampled and underweighted. So it'll be really interesting to see if pollsters have learned a lesson from 2016 and are able to nail it and have accurate predictions on what happens on election day.
Dave, that's a great point. And as part of this conference, one of the panels that has been organized is a panel of Michigan-based pollsters, and it will be interesting, I think, to hear what they have to say about exactly that. How do you crack the code? And if you're interested in trying to figure out what the electorate's going to look like, what kinds of weighting schemes are you using? And of course, all of the challenges to the modern era of polling with technology and everything else. We've seen the president certainly talk about those suburban women, right? He's not at all transparent in his appeals, and yet it seems to me, at least, that in many, aside from his overt appeals for their support, many of the kinds of things that he's talking about, many of the kinds of activities that he's engaged in, it seems as though they're almost designed to alienate that block of voters rather than to draw them in. I'm curious to what your thoughts are on that point, Dave.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting, John, and I think it extends beyond just suburban female educated voters, right? I think that it seems to me that the Trump strategy is all about the base, and he's really good at firing up conservative voters, base voters. He some of his tried and true messaging, the refrains that he hits about the media and the fake news and things like that, right, are really red meat for the base. But I think the rhetoric turns off suburban voters, turns off moderate voters, turns off folks that continually say, look, we don't like the way that American politics is polarized right now. We don't like the way that Congress necessarily behaves all the time with all the constant bickering and back and forth and gridlock and can't get anything done, right? I think he's really just sort of feeding the beast. And I wonder if he is doing enough to bring in voters that he got last time that he needs again.
Yeah, I think Dave just made a really good point about the sort of strategy that completely revolves around turning out the base. And will that strategy work? Will Trump be able to sort of turn out these voters who are typically sort of low propensity voters who maybe didn't vote in the past, but voted for Trump in 2016 and will probably vote for Trump in 2020? Will he be able to garner more support that way? I mean, my instinct is no, because you can't win an election on white male votes alone anymore. So you hit a threshold, or you kind of max out on that strategy at some point. But I'm still curious to see sort of how that plays out. And then I just quickly wanted to comment on Dave's comments on sort of the nature of polling and have these pollsters sort of crack the code on how to sample in these key states. That's definitely something I'm looking to see too. The national polls in 2016 were fine. They ended up to actually be quite accurate, but there were a lot of problems with these state polls that sort of undersampled white voters without college degrees. And I think that was fundamentally due to a lack of understanding about who was going to turn out. And I think it's really interesting, not just in Michigan, but also Pennsylvania and Wisconsin, because a lot of the narrative was, well, people didn't turn out for Hillary like they did in Obama in 2012. And that was true in some places. But I think people missed the part where actually Trump turned out more people than Romney in 2012, and that played a really big role as well.
Yeah, Claire, I think that's a really interesting point. And let's go back to something you said before, about base and maybe it's not enough. And I would agree with that. But, I think that, one dynamic that I think we're seeing both in Michigan and in Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, very likely, and nationally is, I think the number of undecided voters right now is really small. I think most people have made up their mind about Donald Trump, either for him or against him, right? And I think that might be part of the base strategy, right? But I wonder if it's enough in places that are going to be really central to the outcome. in the Electoral College, right? If there are enough of those voters, and I think you're right about places like Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania. Can he get those same voters that didn't turn out in, say, 2008 or 2012, that did turn out in 16? Are they going to come back? Are they going to vote? My hunch is that in some places they will, but in others maybe not. And I find it interesting from a campaign strategy perspective as well. The Trump campaign has got really smart people working for it, right? He's got good consultants, he's got good pollsters, and I wonder if maybe they've got data that we're not seeing, that they've got clued into something. Maybe they're really confident in their turnout strategy. Maybe they're confident in their voter contacts that they've been doing. I'm reading that they've invested heavily in door to door, even during a pandemic, and they think that that's really going to pay some dividends. Time will tell, right? But then on the other side, I read yesterday a comment by Frank Luntz. He's the famous pollster, I guess, right? Who does focus groups on TV. They're not really focus groups, right? I mean, they're made for TV, raise your hand kind of things, right? But he said that the Trump campaign ought to be sued for political malpractice, and we don't know what the outcome is of what sort of which side that's going to fall on. I think it's going to be really interesting to watch.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that, Dave. I'm really interested to see kind of how it all turns out. But I just wanted to say quickly, I think the strategy of really focusing on the base, it's interesting to me that that's sort of the strategy they've taken, because I would have thought the strategy would be, okay, people are turned off by Trump's sort of character and his style and Twitter and all of that, and his sort of bombastic way of being. I thought the strategy would be sort of, let's create a permission structure for these sort of white suburban voters to vote for Trump. And that really hasn't been it. And I'm wondering, not just in this election, but in the future, if Republicans in particular will kind of shift away from this strategy of focusing completely on the base.
So let's move on. And obviously, this strategy question is a huge question for us, and in many ways, as Dave, as you have said, we really won't know whether it's a good strategy until we see whether it works. And I think back to the Romney campaign in 2012, thinking that they nailed it, when in fact they hadn't. Or in 2004, Karl Rove's strategy of appealing to the base, that people said, "What are you doing?" And it turned out to be the right strategy for the right moment. And so it will be interesting to see. Dave, what's one of the things that you're paying attention to in this election cycle?
Well, and maybe we'll get into this later, but I think I'd like to see in the next couple of weeks how some of the messaging in Senate campaigns changes, if at all, and that's across the country. I'm really curious to see in some states if competitive Republican candidates start to move away from Trump even more than they have. And I'm curious to see if some start to message, hey, look, let's not give Democrats a blank check. Let's make sure that Republicans control the Senate. Let's make sure that there's a check and that we don't have unified government with Democrats in control of all three elected branches. Let's keep Republicans in the Senate in the majority, so we can act as a check, right? I mean, I think that'll be telling, because that would tell me, right, that those candidates in those states see the presidency as lost, right, and that they're now putting all their eggs in one basket of hey, look, elect me, this Republican in, I don't know, pick your state, right? North Carolina or Iowa or wherever, right? Arizona, and let's make sure that Democrats can't run roughshod over the federal government, right? I think that'll be an interesting thing to keep an eye on.
I think that's a great point, and it's one of the points I wanted to raise as well. The Senate, to me, is really fascinating this year. Right now, the Republicans control 53 seats out of 100. But of the seats that are up in this election cycle, there are about 14 that most people agree are kind of the really competitive races. And of those 14, 12 of them are currently controlled by Republicans. And so it wouldn't take that many shifts in that many states for the Democrats to take control of the Senate. And as we have seen, the Senate is just vitally important to a president in terms of getting their appointments through. We saw what happened with in the courts when Barack Obama was unable to get stuff moved through the Senate, not just at the Supreme Court level, of course, Merrick Garland, but in lower courts as well. And we see what happens when you've got a Republican Senate carrying the Republican presidential nominees through with barely any inspection of their records, of their qualifications, of anything. That's tremendously important. It's also important, though, in a different way in terms of policy. It seems to me that the Republican Senate right now has not been very interested in doing anything other than confirming President Trump's appointments. They're more than happy to let the president make policy through executive order. They're more than happy to let the courts make policy, activist courts making policy. Who knew that could kind of be a thing? The Democrats, if they're able to control the presidency and if they're able to control the Senate, are not going to be willing to just sit on their hands and wait for 4 years. They're going to want to do stuff. And so that makes each of these races, extremely important, it seems to me. And whether they all, of those 14, a number of them are in states that are battleground states right now for the presidency as well. And I think you're right. If those candidates start to get an indication that there are things going on, then their strategies very well might change, or who knows, Dave?
Yeah, I think it's an interesting sort of quirk of the calendar, if you will, right? I mean, in 2018, Democrats had so many more seats to defend than Republicans did, and there were a number of those competitive seats that Republicans picked up, right? It led to that Republican gain of 3 seats in the Senate. I think that's bucking the historical trend in midterms, right? Is that the president's party loses in the House and the Senate? Well, the president's party picked up seats in 2018 in the U.S. Senate. And set the stage for Mitch McConnell to have a slightly bigger majority, right, and be able to do exactly what you're talking about, John. I think that I guess I would disagree in one instance, and maybe it's a distinction without a difference, right? But Republicans have brought up some legislation in the Senate, specifically COVID relief bills, that have been filibustered by the Democrats, right? And those have gone nowhere. Not because Republicans have been disinterested, although maybe you could quarrel with that and say that, how interested are they really? They know it's not going to win, so they can bring them up, right? But I think there's going to be another small package brought up in the next week or so. We'll see what happens. And I think it's interesting too to look at those vulnerable Democrats. What do they do? And when push comes to shove, do they fall in line, or do they go and try to make an appeal to voters, saying, "Hey, look, I voted for COVID relief, even though it's not what I wanted. I'm willing to compromise and make that kind of appeal to that." I think a lot of voters are looking for, right? They don't want entrenched. They don't want knee-jerk reaction representatives, right? They want folks that are willing to work with the other side. And that got me way on a tangent, right? But main point was in 2018, right? That Democrats had so many more seats to defend. This time, Republicans have a bunch more seats to defend. So it's this cycle of the classes in the U.S. Senate that maybe it evens out now in a little bit for 2022. I'd have to look at what's up in 2 years, but it'll be really interesting to see how the last 2 cycles, 20 and 6 and 18, compare to 22 in terms of sort of the shakeup of the Senate.
Yeah, I just have 2 really quick comments, kind of in response to Dave. So I think in terms of the Senate in 2020, and this isn't a revolutionary comment or observation, but I think the Senate is going to swing whichever way the presidency goes. And I think that's because we just live in a hyper polarized time, and we just don't see the split ticket voting that was sort of common, and even 10 years ago was more common than it is now. So I think that's a really important factor, just that what's going on at the top of the ballot just maps on to what's going on down ballot. And we just don't see that split ticket voting as often. And then I think your comments on the sort of what's going on with the Democrats is really interesting. And I see them in 2020, particularly incumbent Democrats. I live in an interesting district here in Luzerne County, Pennsylvania, where Democrat Matt Cartwright is defending his seat. And I've been paying close attention to this race. And I've noticed in this race and in a lot of other races where Democratic incumbents are defending their seats, they're really just sticking to core issues. Like, they're not sort of wading into the morass of, some of the more heated debates in politics right now. They're sticking with healthcare. They're sort of sticking with those core issues.
I think the idea that there are relatively few people who haven't made up their minds sort of up and down the ticket is one that makes sense. The key, of course, is in these states that we're talking about where these seats are up for grabs, it's not going to take very many votes to swing the state. And so in 2016, we saw a number of states where Republican incumbent Senate candidates ran not a huge amount, but a few points ahead of Donald Trump. Some of those were states where the election was close. Most of them were states where it wasn't especially close. But in some of these states where we expect the margins to be razor thin, if you can come ahead, even a few voters, if you can split her off even a few voters or swing a few independent voters to your side, that really might be all that it takes. And I'm reminded of, way back in 2000, I remember sitting in the studio of our local public radio affiliate and watching election returns come in. And the networks called Michigan relatively early for Al Gore. They made some mistakes in 2000 in terms of calling states, but in Michigan they were spot on in calling it for Gore. But they were very reluctant to call the state Senate or the United States Senate race in Michigan. And in part, it was that uncertainty about how close voters who voted for Al Gore would stick with Debbie Stabenow. That was the race in which she was the challenger running against Spence Abraham. In the studio, we're looking at the returns coming in, and in every single place, their vote totals were almost identical. The exit polls suggested that they were almost identical. But the networks were just a little bit reluctant. They were a little bit unsure about what that Senate dynamic would be and whether or not it would be the case, as Dave suggested, that people might say, okay, I voted for the Democrat for the presidency. I'm going to sort of couch that bet by voting for the Republican for Senate. Mo Fiorina has been talking about that as a real thing for a long time. And I think sometimes it's overblown. But again, when these elections are close, it doesn't take very many people to think that way to make a difference. Dave?
Yeah, and John, I think that's an important point, and then it really makes you think about and wonder or consider maybe all of the money that's being poured into these Senate races, and Michigan is a fine example, right? Tens of millions of dollars, not only from the candidates but from the NRSC and the DSCC, outside super PACs, right? They are spending tens of millions of dollars for a few votes. And it is all of those dollars going for that small slice of the electorate that might be undecided, right? Or that might be gettable for one side or the other, right? And it's going to be, and it's money well spent on their, at least on the party side and on the super PAC side, right? Because any one of these close Senate rates could be the difference between Democrats having a majority and Republicans having a majority.
So one of the things that I've been paying attention to, in addition to the Senate side, is simply where the candidates are going. We kind of alluded to this earlier that the polling was off in a number of states. The publicly available polling was off in a number of states in 2016. But I think that in addition to that, there were a lot of sort of late breaking voters, late deciding voters, either deciding in terms of which candidate they were going to vote for or whether or not they were actually going to show up at the polls. The dynamic this year with early voting, certainly in Michigan, but in other places as well, is different, right? People are not waiting until election day to cast their ballots. But what the Trump campaign saw in 2016 that many of the rest of us missed was that there was an opening, a weakness in support for Clinton in places like Wisconsin and in places like Michigan. And so in those last few days, where did President Trump, or then candidate Trump, go? Well, he went to Milwaukee. He went to Grand Rapids. He went to places where they saw some sort of opening. They saw some sort of weakness. They have access to information that we don't have. They have access to all kinds of data and insight that we're simply not privy to. And so, right now it's still early enough. We can kind of look at where they're going and say, oh yeah, those are the battleground states. That makes sense. But I think especially in that last week, the places that they choose to go, the places where they're investing resources, those are places that as analysts, we need to pay special attention to as well. Dave?
Yeah, John, I think that's a really important point. And I think there's a great contrast between 2020 and 2016, and not necessarily with Trump, because I think you're exactly right in the opening that they saw, and they saw it, they took it, and they exploited it. Right? I mean, and they were able to do that in part because the Clinton campaign didn't see that as a threat, right? They didn't see that as a potential danger spot in places like Wisconsin and Michigan and Pennsylvania, right? We heard all this talk of the vaunted blue wall, right? And it only took a few thousand votes in each of those states to make it crumble. And I think you're seeing the Biden campaign try not to let that happen again, because Biden is here in Michigan, he is in Wisconsin, he's in Pennsylvania. Surrogates are in those states. Biden has been here, and guess where he's been? He's been to Macomb County. He's been to Wayne County, right? He's going places where he needs just frankly a little bit more support than Hillary Clinton got, and he can flip the state. And I assume, Claire, it's the same in Pennsylvania.
Yeah, very similar dynamic in Pennsylvania for sure. But I always go back to, and I just want to kind of echo what you've already said, both Dave and John. I think those are really good points. But I always think about how Trump's combined victory in Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania was so small. 78,000 votes out of the 14 million cast determined, the outcome of where those states swung towards Trump. So even a slight shift away from Trump could just make all the difference. And I do think the context of 2020 is so different because attitudes are just so much more crystallized. So Trump doesn't really have the sort of benefit in 2016 of those undecided voters sort of last minute breaking towards Trump. So I'm interested to see sort of what happens there. But yeah, I think it's just always important to remember how few votes in those states really sort of made the difference. And that any small shift away from Trump could change the outcome of the 2020 election. And I can kind of save some of these more specific comments for when we talk about Michigan. But I'm interested in particular in non-college educated white women. I talked about college educated white women before, really shifting strongly towards Democratic candidates. But we've also seen non-college educated white women sour on Trump a little bit too. And I think even the tiniest shift from that group, because of all the points that were just made, could really make a difference.
You want to take a moment now and elaborate on that a little bit more? while we're on the topic, this might be a good time to continue with that.
Yeah, sure. So I guess to start, as I've said, I'm from the Rust Belt state of Pennsylvania. So a lot of the things I'm paying attention to in Pennsylvania, I'm also paying attention to in Michigan. And again, one of those things is really non-college educated white women. So again, we know that college educated white women have moved pretty dramatically towards Democrats. But I'm curious about non-college educated white women for a couple reasons. So according to some polling data, they're definitely less enthusiastic about Donald Trump than they were in 2016. While in contrast, white college educated or white non-college educated men have pretty much sort of stuck it out with Trump, and they haven't shifted in any sort of discernible way. And I think this is of interest in Michigan, and in Wisconsin and Pennsylvania, because all three states have a pretty high population relative to other states of non-college educated white voters. So I'm really looking at that group in particular and what non-college educated white women are going to do, how big the gender gap is going to be in that subset of white voters. And I think 2018 gives us some evidence about how this might play out, because we did see some white working class voters, particularly women, go a little bit more Democratic. And, from my comments earlier, we know that Trump really can't win with only non-college educated white men alone. So I'm interested to see what that particular group of women are going to do in 2020.
So in terms of what I think we need to pay attention to in the last couple of weeks here in Michigan, and I think this applies to Wisconsin and Pennsylvania too, I'll give you three things. One, we've touched on this a little bit before, is turnout. And in particular, in places like Wayne County, where Democrats, I think it's pretty simple. Democrats didn't show up for Hillary Clinton. She got 80,000 fewer votes out of Wayne County alone than Barack Obama did 4 years before. I think you got to look at a place like Macomb County, where you get some of those non-college educated white folks, union members, auto industry folks that frankly really responded to Trump's message on trade and manufacturing jobs, and that populist message that frankly Bernie Sanders also brought to Michigan in 2016 and 2020. So turnout in Macomb, and I think in those places where Trump did really well in 16, in terms of vote percentages, right? Can he keep those turnout levels up in places that are up north and in the UP, rural areas, right? That are traditionally Republican areas, but where Trump squeezed a little bit more juice out of the turn-up in 2016. Can he repeat that in 2020? I think another thing to watch are the folks that, and I think again this applies to all those states that are so critical and we're so close because of the margins. In Michigan, in 2016, there were 325,000 people who did not make a choice between Trump or Clinton on their ballots. 75,000 people just skipped the presidential race altogether, right? And they voted down ballot, but they skipped that. They walked into their voting booth and said, really, this is what I got to pick from? Forget it, I'm not doing it, right? And another 250,000 people voted third party, which is a huge number. That's a five-fold increase from 2012. So there's 325,000 people out there who made some pretty sophisticated vote choices, right? I think they're voters. I think they're going to turn out in 2020. And what they do could shift the state, right? I mean, we're talking about such small margins. And think about that, right? Claire told us that 78,000 people across those three states, if they shift, right, it shifts the outcome. And there's 325,000 votes up for grabs in Michigan right now of pretty sophisticated voters who are probably going to vote in 2020. What do? right? What's their behavior going to be? Are they going to, and from all the polls so far, third party support's way down relative, right? So I think they're going to make a choice from the two major party candidates. And the last one, real quick, we talked about polls before. I think that both bases could be making mistakes if they focus on the polls too much. And I think you're going to have some Republicans come out and say, oh, the polls were wrong in 2016, they're going to be wrong again in 2020. Well, that might be true, right? But I think that if Republicans dismiss out of hand polling data, that is to their peril. There is information, there is good data that comes from polling, right? And I think that it's a warning sign. It doesn't mean that it's right or that Trump's going to lose, right? But it's a warning sign. And on the other side, I think if Democrats don't believe that there are some silent Trump voters out there who don't want to tell a pollster, who don't want to admit that they're going to support Donald Trump and pull that lever for him, I think they're fooling themselves. So and I think that's why we get some of these wildly divergent polls that we're seeing across all these different states.
So that might be a good way for us to transition a little more directly to talk about the state of Michigan. Obviously, many of the things that we've been talking about are things that folks everywhere in the country are paying attention to with regard to just about every state. And in many ways, Michigan becomes a microcosm. It's competitive. It's got sort of an urban-rural split that many states don't have. There are sizable minority populations. We're not, the rest of the country isn't exactly like us with all of our challenges and problems. But in many ways, Michigan is quite representative. So in addition to some of the things that we've been talking about so far, what's going to matter in Michigan? What are things that the two of you are paying attention to here that the rest of us ought to be paying attention to as well? Claire, you've already talked a little bit about the women's vote. Are there other things beyond that, or are there things related to that we should be watching for?
Yeah, I think the importance of the women's vote really can't be sort of underestimated in this election because, as I was saying before about sort of non-college educated white women, I think that's a really important group in Michigan. I'm also curious to see turnout, particularly from people of color, women of color in particular, in areas like Detroit. So Clinton lost voters in 2016 compared to Obama in 2012, specifically in Detroit. So I'm curious to see kind of what goes on there. Maybe you two will have more to say about that, as I'm not kind of an expert on Michigan. But I'm just curious to see what's going to happen sort of in the Detroit area, and then definitely with non-college educated white women.
Yeah, Claire, I think that's on the money, and it's in places where Hillary Clinton underperformed. I think that are important to watch in terms of turnout. Let me take in a little bit of a different direction and change topics a bit. But we've got this competitive Senate race between Gary Peters and John James here in Michigan, and that's really intriguing. We've talked a little bit about Senate contests earlier, but I'll be very curious to see if John James runs ahead of Trump. And my hunch is that he probably will. And I think for those that don't know, John James ran against Debbie Stabenow in 2018, and he lost, but he came closer than a lot of people thought. And I think there are a couple important differences between 18 and 20 that are in John James's favor, and that might be enough to get him over the hump and pull off a surprise win, right? And those are one is funding. He had a pretty significant fundraising and spending gap with Debbie Stabenow 2 years ago. I think about $5 million. I think she had like 17 million that she raised, and he raised 12 maybe. In addition, the NRSC abandoned John James pretty early, and they pulled their money and they spent it elsewhere. This time around, as I've alluded to before, there's tens of millions of dollars pouring into Michigan, both into the Peters and James campaign, but also from the parties and from super PACs, right? And it appears to be a pretty even playing field in terms of money. One other really interesting thing, and John, you may know more about this than I do, given your geographic location, is in 2018, Debbie Stabenow continued her long run of having support from the agriculture community, from farmers, from PACs and interest groups associated with ag. And Gary Peters doesn't have that this time. Those groups are backing John James. And I think that's going to be really interesting to see what happens in places in West Michigan that are fruit farmers and agriculture. What happens in the Thumb area of Michigan? That those folks have been with Debbie Stabenow, and they voted for Debbie Stabenow in large part in 2018. What do they do in 2020?
Yeah, that's a great question. Of course, Stabenow's been on the Ag Committee and been the chair and the ranking member, and so she's been very involved in agricultural policy in Michigan in a way that Gary Peters hasn't been, in part because Stabenow's already there, and so there's not a seat for him on that important committee. Many of those farmers have been hurt in ways that sort of vary from kind of crop to crop by Trump's policies, and at the same time, some of them have benefited, and so that really is kind of a wide open set of folks. I think you're right with it's hard to remember this far back, 2 years. But basically, John James won the Republican primary in 2018 because at the last minute he got support from Donald Trump. And, he was locked in a very tight battle for the nomination. That Trump endorsement really put some separation between him and the rest of the field. When we got to the general election, that didn't necessarily help him. There were blocks of voters where that didn't help him. In this election cycle, he is, at least in his advertising, he doesn't talk about Donald Trump. He is, running. Saw just the other day that at some of the Trump rallies, he's there early, speaks to the crowd, and then leaves before Trump shows up because he apparently doesn't want to be seen with him. But he also is sort of running away from public policy. And his policy positions are, I have really big biceps, and I'm going to make things better in Washington, and Gary Peters is bad. And other than that, I'm not really sure what it is that he's taken a position on, if in fact he's taken a position on much of anything. I think all of those strategies are going to be useful strategies in a presidential election year when all of the attention is focused on the presidential race, or so much of the attention is focused on the presidential race. In 2018, a lot of that focus was on the governor's race and the United States Senate race. And it simply is a different campaign atmosphere now compared to just 2 years ago. Dave?
One additional comment there, John. I think it's interesting. I think you're on the money about the Trump endorsement in 2018 maybe being the difference for John James in winning that primary. And it's interesting to note now how some of his past statements are being used against him, right? And it's good politics from the Democrat side, from the Peters campaign, right, to use his statements about not repealing and replacing Obamacare. I think the other big one is that James supports Trump 2,000%, right? Those are out there. He said those. It may be 2 years ago, but it's on the record. He said it, and they're using it effectively against him.
Yeah, I just had a really quick comment. I think everything you both said is really spot on. And I do think because Biden has a non-trivial lead right now in Michigan, that definitely bodes really well for Gary Peters. And I'm going to contradict myself a little bit from my earlier comments when I was talking about how split ticket voting isn't very common, and the top of the ballot matters a lot for down ballot races. But I do want to revisit that a little bit, because in 2018 we saw in Wisconsin, and I always think about this race, we saw Tammy Baldwin maintain her Senate seat with a pretty big lead over her opponent. I think she won by something like 8 points, whereas Tony Evers in Wisconsin only won by, I think, like a point. It was a very small margin. And I guess I'm kind of posing this question to you both, but do you think that kind of scenario could occur in Michigan in terms of the Senate race, where maybe Michigan goes for Biden at the presidential level, but then John James in the Senate? I'm just curious about that.
Well, I guess anything's possible, right? In a year like 2020, right? We've seen anything is possible. I think that it depends on a couple of things. And maybe I'm making too much out of this, but I think the support from that agriculture community, I think, is significant. How significant, we'll see. But and John's right that some of those farmers have been hurt by Trump policies. But what I and some have benefited, right? It's been a mixed bag. But I think that it's interesting to look at what the agriculture groups are saying, right? They're not mentioning Trump. They're talking about John James, and they've given him their endorsement. And I think that, like I said, I think that's significant. I wonder too, and this gets to something Claire mentioned before about turnout in key places, right? I mean, one of the elephants in the room is John James is an African-American Republican, right? So does that get him any more votes in places like Detroit? Does that get him votes in Flint or Saginaw or Muskegon or Benton Harbor, right? I mean, and I don't know. We'll see. He might, right? He might get some more votes that another Senate Republican candidate wouldn't get. And I guess what I'll do is I'll end with a question here too, because it brings this brings it to my mind. Do you guys make anything of the reports that Hispanic Americans, African American voters are marginally moving more to Trump than other Republican candidates in the past? And if so, does that make a difference?
So I'll go first and weigh in on a couple of things there. I do think the fact that John James is African American gives him the potential to siphon off a few additional votes from the African American community in 2020. That didn't so much happen in 2018. But in 2018, he was running as a Republican. And in 2020, he's running as somebody who is not political. And I think that potentially, at least, could set him up for some additional success. And again, in these close races, we're not talking about big shifts being necessary. We're talking about relatively small shifts that could be enough. When it comes to other parts of the country and sort of the rest of the country in terms of the racial dynamics of this election, it's hard to imagine that as a Democratic candidate, Joe Biden could run very much better in terms of vote choice than any Democratic candidate in the past. Part of the question is about turnout and enthusiasm, and we certainly saw that in Michigan in 2016. We also saw it on the other way in a place like Alabama in the special election for the Senate seat there after Jeff Sessions joined the Trump cabinet. And so, there are kind of interesting dynamics about how race plays out. And again, not because it's necessarily the case that African-American voters are going to vote for Republicans by large margins. But if they vote, even if that's a slight shift in some of these close places, or if it has an impact on whether or not they show up versus whether or not they don't, then it doesn't take very many votes. The other thing I would just add to this is it's so hard. We mentioned a little bit earlier on about the problems with polling. When you're talking about relatively small groups of voters in most states, and thinking about sort of how you measure the opinion of those communities, it's just really difficult. And unless you've got a substantial oversampling, and I mean, it's just really hard. And so it could be the case that Latino voters are thinking about this election differently. It could be the case that some African American voters are as well. Or it could be the case that there are one or two folks who are grabbing the megaphone and saying, hey, look, people that are like me are behaving differently this time around. And I'm not sure I know which of those it is at this point, at least. Claire, did you want to comment on any of that stuff?
Yeah, I'll chime in on Dave's question about Latinx voters potentially moving towards Trump. This is something I've been thinking about a lot lately. And I think it's hard because, like John mentioned, it's difficult to get good polling data when you're looking at these sort of smaller subgroups of voters. The error just gets larger and larger as you get more specific when you're looking at these groups. But I think I have a couple of things to say. So I think the first thing is that this is an area where I think gender matters a lot. So I do think it's conceivable that Latino men could be moving towards Trump a little bit more. His economic message might resonate with them a little bit more. I don't think we're going to see the same with Latino women. We've seen there's some great work by Cristina Bejarano and Ana Sampaio on Latinx voters. And there is a gender gap there, right? Latino women tend to be more liberal than Latino men. So I think the group, to get even more specific, to pay attention to there is with Latino men. And I think it's also in specific areas. So I think, we want to look at Latino voters in Florida, where that could really become an issue. And I think this is also an area where, again, digging even more into subgroups, there's variation among Latino voters, Cuban voters versus Venezuelan voters. So I think ethnicity really matters as well, too. And the last thing I wanted to mention is the role of misinformation is something that's concerning me a lot, especially in regards to Latinx voters. I was listening to a podcast, I think it was The Daily yesterday, about Latinx voters and misinformation on Facebook specifically, and how the proliferation of that misinformation, whether it's sort of like QAnon content or misinformation about voting, how that's becoming of particular concern to Latinx voters and how they're going to turn out and vote in the 2020 election. So that's also something, we don't really have a lot of good data on that, but that's definitely something I'm paying attention to as well.
So we've almost used an hour talking about this election. Is there anything that we haven't talked about yet that you think is important and that we ought to be paying attention to? Are there things that we maybe skimmed over, didn't give enough time to? Dave?
This is not the answer you were thinking I was going to give, John, but I think the answer to your question is yes. But I know we wanted to try to keep this to like an hour. And if we went into all the other stuff, we'd be here for till, deep into the night.
That's probably true. And I should point out, I should have maybe said this at the beginning, that we're recording this on Wednesday, October 21st. And so by the time that some folks are watching it, particularly in the craziness of this election cycle, in some ways, we've seen this completely flat election where nothing seems to be doing much to move voters. And at the same time, every day something crazy is happening. And so if there are things that in 2 days suddenly become important and we didn't talk about them, that's not our fault. We didn't know. We didn't know that was coming down the pipe. But Claire, anything that you want to add as well that we've missed so far?
The first thing that kind of came to my mind is, of course, the pandemic and what the state of the pandemic is. And, that's been an ever-present sort of issue in this campaign for the past couple of months. But I am curious to see if that shifts anything. I mean, like we've been saying, this has been a very stable race, but we're also seeing, at least in Pennsylvania, and I know a lot of other states, cases rising. So I'm wondering if that will sort of make the virus even more salient than it already has been for voters. And in particular, not to always make everything about gender, but among women voters, I think that might kind of seal the deal for a lot of women voters if we have a really, bad second wave or a spike in cases nationwide. We know that women, from polling data, tend to care more about social welfare issues than men. So I think that could really make a difference. And we also know that women have been, hit a little bit harder by the economic effects of the pandemic. So I'm curious to see how that plays out in the 11th hour here of the election.
Yeah, that's a great point, and in particular, I think about the fact that the president has tried to discourage people from voting early, voting by mail, voting absentee. He doesn't always use those terms the same way that all the rest of us use them. Is it going to be the case in some of these states that Republican voters haven't voted before Election Day and then suddenly find themselves or members of their family sick? We're seeing rates increase, not just in Pennsylvania, we're seeing it here in Michigan as well. And, in places right now like North Dakota, when you control for the size of the population, the infection rate, the rate of new infections is to the moon. Twice as many new infections per day when you control for population than we saw in Florida in the summer when people were saying, "Oh my gosh, Florida is having this huge outbreak." And so, in addition to sort of the politics of the pandemic, whether or not the pandemic has an effect on turnout in key states, it seems to me is important as well. And then that loops back to the idea of misinformation that you referred to just a minute ago. And the fact that it doesn't seem to be the case that the pandemic crisis is over. It doesn't seem to be the case that tomorrow, the day after the election, suddenly everybody that's sick is going to be better, and we're not going to have to worry about this again. It seems to be just the opposite, and whether or not that will have an impact on what happens on election day or with all of the early voting that's going on election season. One last thing that I'm interested in that doesn't so much affect these races in sort of a big way, but in a much smaller way. Here in Kalamazoo, where my university is, we've got both Western Michigan University, Kalamazoo College, and a community college as well. For both of the four-year schools, there are a lot of students who are taking our classes but aren't currently living in our community. And one of the things that we saw in 2016 and in 2018 is that in our county, which is usually a highly competitive county, the student precincts, or the campus area precincts, were very heavily Democratic. And if some of those folks aren't living in those places, is that going to have an impact on some of our countywide races? Now, most of our students are Michigan residents, and so if they're voting in Michigan, it's going to sort of wash out with the statewide races. It's going to wash out with the electoral college votes in the presidential race. But in some of our county level races and state legislative races, is the absence of students, or at least the smaller number of students in our community, going to make a difference? And there's variation across the state. If they're voting at home, it might balance some of the differences that we saw in the urban-rural split in the last election. But it might make a difference. It might make a difference for us in our community. Dave?
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that, John, because I think it's interesting to watch that not just at Western and in Kalamazoo County, but in Ingham County as well, at Michigan State, where there was a lot of students who voted for Alyssa Slotkin in the 8th Congressional District in 2018, and she beat Mike Bishop, an incumbent Republican that year. in large part on the backs of student voters, student engagement in East Lansing. And she won the Ingham County portion of that district by 40 points. Now, if those students aren't at Michigan State and aren't voting in that district, and I have no idea what students would do, right? Would they be at Michigan State and vote there? Would they go to Michigan State but be at home and vote absentee there? Or would they be at home and switch their registration? Who knows, right? But that's an interesting thing to watch. And it's, to this point, that district has not looked terribly competitive. She's got a huge funding advantage. I think she's done a nice job of positioning herself in the last 2 years as a good fit for that district. But it is a Republican district, and it's in Charlie Cook's partisan voter index, it's R+4, right? So it's got more Republicans in it than it does Democrats. And are there enough votes that might be absent from Michigan State's campus that could make a difference there? I think that right, this is one of those ways that the pandemic has thrown things off in a way that is that unexpected, that makes it even just harder for people to campaign. And I think that that's something that we're going to learn lessons about that for the next couple of years, about how the pandemic changed campaigning.
Yeah, just to piggyback off everything that's kind of already been said, I don't think it's a trivial concern to kind of wonder what's going to happen now that a lot of college students aren't at school where they might be voting. And I just wanted to note some work by Melissa Deckman, where she's found that Gen Z voters are particularly politically active. So that's just something to keep in mind with the question you raised, John, which kind of underscores why that might matter this election cycle. She has found that Gen Z voters are particularly politically active, or more active than past generations, especially Gen Z women. So that's something to keep in mind too.
So as Dave said, you get some folks who study elections together, and we could go on into the night. At this point, I'm going to exercise the chair's prerogative and bring our panel to a close. I want to thank my colleagues, Claire Gothrow from Rutgers, Dave Dulio from Oakland University, and I want to thank you, our audience, for participating in this year's virtual meeting of the Michigan Political Science Association. Look forward to being back together in a room, in a place next year, where we can look back at the 2020 presidential election and say, aha, this is what happened, and boy, we nailed it. Thanks very much.